We're about 3 weeks away from the next Democratic presidential debate, but despite a large field, polling appears to point to 3 candidates who could actually take on Trump. Now, the president's approval rating is steady, but a new NBC Wall Street Journal poll reveals that a record 69% of registered voters say they do not like him personally.
That same poll highlights how the Democratic Party is shifting. Once considered radical ideas, now 89% of primary voters support allowing Dreamers to stay in the U.S., 82% want to see student debt forgiven, and 81% are in favor of free college tuition. Joining us to discuss this shift in the party is host of the Majority Report, Sam Seder. Good to see you, sir.
Nice to see you guys.
So when you look at these numbers on Democratic primary voters' priorities, I mean, you've got free college tuition, you've got shifting to 100% renewable energy, you've got Medicare for all or Medicare buy-in. What does that say to you about how the party has shifted and where it might be heading?
I mean, I think it's been pretty dramatic, having, sort of followed this professionally for 15 years now. The past 5 years or so have been a dramatic shift in the center of the party in terms of where they are on the issues. So I think it's pretty impressive. And you look at those numbers too, across the board, all of those things you talk about have a majority of support across parties. So.
Right.
I mean, that bodes well, I guess, for the future, knock on wood.
Sam, one thing we're tracking very closely here is this new Iowa poll shows Elizabeth Warren beating Joe Biden in Iowa for the very first time, could put her on track to the nomination. As a progressive in this space, do you believe that Elizabeth Warren would have the wherewithal to actually push her policies? We talk a lot on this show about the theories of change between Bernie Sanders' political revolution and then Elizabeth Warren's working within the system in order to enact her policies of change. What do you think?
Well, I don't know if they're mutually exclusive, right? I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a Bernie Sanders administration where he wouldn't call on the expertise of people around him to work the inside game. And it's hard for me to imagine an Elizabeth Warren administration where the movement that Bernie Sanders has built wouldn't be activated and pushing for the same goals. So I'm not convinced that it's mutually exclusive in that respect. I mean, I think it's clear you have the numbers. You need to have people activated on the ground, though, to push these policies forward, to punish politicians who ignore them.
Right.
Sure. I mean, what do you think of the fact that those two candidates have appealed to such different sort of coalitions thus far? I mean, Elizabeth Warren, things seem to be shifting a bit, but up to this point, she's really had her strongest support among affluent white liberals. Sanders has the more multiracial working class coalition. When on the surface, they seem to be championing a lot of the same policies. What do you think accounts for that difference?
I mean, that's a good question, but I think to a certain extent, Sanders has been building this broad base of support for years, and I think that his campaign, and I think just more broadly speaking, has been actively engaging unions and these communities on a grassroots level for 4 or 5 years, and I think to a certain extent, I think he may represent a little bit more of a threat to folks who are a little bit more wealthy, but I think to a large extent, I think he's just sold himself to folks across the board in that sort of that cohort more.
Sam, what do you think the biggest mistake that either of those candidates could make, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, in this primary? What's the biggest mistake they could make?
In the primary?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, I think I think just sort of trying to appeal to the center. I mean, I think both of them have a message, and I think to the extent that people perceive it as authentic, is what's going to bring out their voters. And then I would say, obviously, like, they need to be organizing, and I think to a certain extent, we're not going to really know. And we can look at the polls, and I know that Bernie's up in some states, and Warren in others, and Biden in others himself. But I don't know that we have a very clear sense of who the electorate's going to be. We just saw the numbers that college students doubled their participation in the off-year election. It's sort of hard to know who's really going to show up in these early state primaries.
Sure, especially in caucus states, it can be particularly challenging to know who's actually going to show up to caucus. What do you make of this whole discussion around electability? How do you think about electability as we look towards the general election?
I mean, I think electability is important. And frankly, if you had asked me 6 months ago, I would have said that I think just about every major Democratic candidate running could win. I got to be honest with you that, full disclosure, I'm not necessarily a fan of his policies, but I'm surprised by Joe Biden. I mean, I think there's a lot of people in the establishment of the Democratic Party who feel like this guy is just leaking oil. And I think it's not hard to see a scenario where by the time we get to the general, Biden is just not up to the task. I mean, he's not the Joe Biden of even 4 or 5 years ago. And to a certain extent, it's hurting him even that much more because a lot of his policies are frankly stuck in another era. And he doesn't seem to have the elasticity to sort of pivot from those. And so, I mean, I think that could be a problem.
One interesting thing, Sam, we've seen in the polling is that the second choice for a lot of these Biden candidates is Bernie Sanders. But my money is that D.C. establishment folks, their second choice would be Elizabeth Warren. How would you foresee that playing out if you saw a lot of these voters drift towards Bernie Sanders, but then the establishment kind of would pick Elizabeth Warren as a Ted Cruz type candidate if we use the 2016 analogy? How would that play out?
Well, it's hard for me to imagine a scenario where any one of those top three candidates drop out before the convention, frankly. And I think it's conceivable to me that Warren may end up being, a compromise candidate for the establishment. I think that they have been surprised, frankly, at Biden's weakness, and I think at the strength of both Sanders and Warren. So that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, she's if it comes out that way, how that plays out, that's a good question.
And Sam, on Biden, Trump is terrible. Let's put aside what he did vis-a-vis Ukraine. But are there legitimate questions there around Hunter Biden, around Biden's brother, that should be fully hashed out during the Democratic primary?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think obviously you've got to hash out everything about every candidate. And I don't know, there's a lead graph in that New York Times piece from yesterday saying there's no evidence of any wrongdoing. And then you start to wonder, well, what follows all of this? But I do think that, look, part of it is, I think there is an institutional corruption, right? That on some level is people sort of hand wave away as that's what everybody does. And certainly Donald Trump's corruption is at another level. But then you're talking about really some type of structural change. And so, I think it's important to vet it. I think it's important because it's something that, I mean, look, the general election is going to be about Donald Trump trying to suppress the Democratic vote and maximize his. And it's not going to be a persuasion election. Donald Trump is not going to convince anybody who is even, of those, the significant percentage of people who don't like his policies. He's not going to convince them. He's going to try and maximize his voter base and suppress the Democrats. And I think that, like, to the extent that there's anything there, it's something that I could perceive as suppressing the Democratic vote. This notion of, like, they're both corrupt. Why would I go out and vote for either one of them? I mean, I think that's one of the problems that Biden has running on this notion of character. It's the same problem that frankly, that Clinton had. If you play on that playing field, you're giving Donald Trump the ability to drag you into the mud. If you're playing on a different playing field, Trump doesn't have the ability to do that. I mean, Donald Trump is not going to get out there and argue as to why getting rid of private insurance in the long run does not provide your best health outcomes. He's just not capable of doing that. And so, by going out there and presenting a notion of I am more morally sound or whatever it is, I think creates a liability for yourself.
Yeah.
And you better
Yeah.
be very squeaky clean.
I think that's a very good point.
Sam,
Thank
thanks so
you,
much for joining
Sam.
us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yep. Next on Rising, a 12-term congressman who left his mark on healthcare, veterans affairs, and many other progressive issues.
He even influenced little-known politician from his home state, one President Barack Obama. Author Devin Hansen shares Congressman Lane Evans' story. That's next.